tell me what you're currently doing with your life?
At the present time, I've been consulting to a number of corporations and institutions throughout the world, all related to media, from consulting to the Disney Corporation, and particularly to the ABC Family Channel, to the BBC, to TV Globo in Brazil, and to such far-off places as Singapore and Bangkok, and Hong Kong with Run Run Shaw, and in this country currently with the BBC as well.
Okay, now in the early 1970s, you were freelancing and then were hooked up with Warner Communications. Can you explain who reached out to you, what they told you the project was going to be, and when they did, what your vision was of what they should do with it?
I got a call from Steve Ross, who was president of Warner, and he called me on the phone and wanted to know. He was in a nearby hotel, the Hilton in Rye, New York, and my home was in Rye, and Steve was on the phone, an old friend of mine, and he said, Mike, can we come over and see you? And he was with Ted Ashley, whose company he had just purchased, which was the Ashley Famous company, and represented clients of substantial stature in the media industry. He came over to the house and said, you know, I'm thinking of getting into the cable markets. And I can't get into the cable markets unless I have some sort of programming. And I want you to get with a guy by the name of Gus Hauser, who's going to start our cable division, as well as several other responsibilities he had. And I want you to pick a town or a city where we should test it in, or a suburb of that city, and at the same time consider what you'd put on the channels that had nothing to do with the present broadcasting channels, like a local station or a network like ABC. We had to have something new. And I said, well, what do you call that? And he said, well, we're being called cable television, and it's going to come into the home as a special service. And we're going to have cable franchises in various cities, which will be awarded by the local townships and municipalities. And I said, well, you mean it's not a network? No, he says, in each community, you get a franchise and you can sell your cable service to those homes having television. And I said, would they compete with the networks? And he said, yes. Well, I said, well, I have some background in programming for the networks and what they feel, but that means we have to create programs. And I can't do that right out of the hat. Well, he says, well, why don't we start it in one community where we can know we have the right to go into, and that would be Arlington, a suburb in Columbus, and other areas immediately around Columbus, not in Columbus proper, but the people who work in Columbus at the university or for the government. It's a substantial community, many churches, and no inner city breakdown. I said, that's great. I think that's Columbus would be fine for me. Denver is pretty good. Minneapolis would be very good, but so be it. So he said, well, why don't you get with Gus Hauser, who's going to run the operation, and you supply the programming. Well, I wasn't terribly concerned about programming. I had programmed a network, both at NBC and CBS, starting with the Today Show at NBC. And then later on, I was very active in nighttime shows, whether it's the Show of Shows with Caesar and Coca, or the Tonight Shows with Steve Allen or Johnny Carson, and the afternoon and daytime soap operas. Full service programming to the population was not a challenge for me. It's just that the delivery system was going to be different. So I had meetings with appointed a young staff under a budget given to me by the Warner Company, and Steve Ross said, you spend what you want. And I said, well, I don't need any high executives. I need a bunch of young people who know we're establishing a new media, stepping out just as we knew we were stepping out when we started television in 52 with the Today Show. It was going to be new, and there's going to be young people who weren't have any preconceived idea what the media should be, and would fail or succeed for a while, and eventually we would create a service that we used in the cable channel, on the cable channels. I didn't know how many channels there'd be. I did know that there was no programming for children on the networks, little children, like Sesame Street. It was on PBS, but not on the bigger networks. And I thought maybe a nice idea to call it Pinwheel. Later we called it Nickelodeon. And the Dick Clark Show had just gone off, and there was no programming on the air for teenagers. So we started something called MTV. Now, there's no question that those weren't the most important audience we wanted to reach. But it's always better to start out with programming that was not being a competitive factor to what was on the networks or the leading stations, because they would have competitive programming that had a lot more money than I would have had in Columbus. So as a result of that, we started Nickelodeon, first called Pinwheel, and then MTV, which we stayed with that name. And those were two of the primary channels. We did have a talking channel like the Today Show. We did have a fourth channel which dealt with civic activities that the mayor could come on. We had 3 film channels where they could pay for the films. But it was the first example in the United States of a full program service. And more important than that, people knew that it was the start of something, because everybody was seeking to, big companies, Time, Warner's, GE, all were trying to get franchises in cable in the various cities of the United States. Remember, there was no cable any place except in San Diego in 1952. That was a test city that the FCC was letting experimentation to take place. And Warner's was fighting with all their program know-how and management know-how, starting with Steve Ross and a man by the name of Ted Ashley, to really create program services that would eventually compete what was on the local stations or the networks. And the networks weren't carrying many feature films, the networks weren't carrying special programs for children, as I indicated, and there weren't many programs around for the teenage people. If we could get a hold on them, they would command the dial up until 9 o'clock at night, and after that we would come up with some other kinds of programming. Sure, we had some sexy programs on the channel, which we got a lot of revenue from, that the housewives looked at during the day. And we did have a news service for the mayor to announce different activities that the municipality was involved in. And we did have 3 columns of feature movies. We didn't have many movies that were of the quality that you see today on the movie channels, American movie channels, and 6 pay channels that you get through program Cablevision franchises. But we do have, right off from get-go, we did have about 15 or 14 channels, which gave them a bigger choice than the 3 network stations and the 2 independent stations that were delivering broadcast services. It meant it tripled the capacity for the television set to deliver you something on the cable. Now, the cable wasn't a simple thing to have right away. First of all, you have to have remote control. And how are you going to get remote control unless you had a little handheld piece of equipment? And in those days, you had to have a cord that went from the set to the little box in your hand, and that would permit you to switch to different channels. And I went to the telephone company, we got the color of equipment, we got a line that would be thin enough to trip over and not trip over. It was 12 feet long or 15 feet long, depending upon the home that was buying it. And it had a cord that went to the television set. It was not a remote control. That came in many years later, about 5 years later, where you could have a remote that would switch it from channel to channel as we do now. But it was a big step. And Columbus was an experimental place for it. It wasn't even in proper Columbus. It was in Arlington, I think, and 2 other suburbs. And the program services, because of, first because on the children's channel, Nickelodeon, because I had helped start Sesame Street with Joan Gans Cooney, I thought, and I took a member of their staff to come over and help us do Pinwheel, later called Nickelodeon. And I took a person from a radio station who was doing pop music for young people to monitor and control the Nickelodeon, the MTV part of the services. After that, we used films and the Mayor's Channel and civic activities and commercial selling channels of products that we could assign to the local merchants or to national advertisers at will, and so started to sell spots on the cable company at very low cost, probably giving them away at the beginning, to advertisers, both local and national, who would buy time on the programs we were broadcasting. It was fortunate for the viewers at home that at the beginning we only had programs that didn't have advertisers. As the system started to attract many subscribers, and it was a big jump very early, particularly the affluent homes. This wasn't in the slums of New York or anything. This went to the upper middle class communities surrounding Columbus and not into the city proper. And as a result, we got substantial revenues very early to advertise on the channel. The BBC covered the opening broadcast. It was heralded as a new experiment, and everybody was very excited about it. And within 2 or 3 years, Warner's got a lot of very good franchises throughout the country, but after all, there were probably over 1,000 franchises eventually given out. So they maybe got 5 or 6% of the market at best. Many other companies started, local civic leaders took over, power players and politicos were able to acquire the franchises in their local cities. In bigger cities, there very often were 2 or 3 companies, but the cities were divided up. New York City, for example, had 3 major companies in 3 different areas that did sell cable services and provided different cable services because they had different goals. But the cable companies exploded with channels like HBO and Showtime, which were started shortly after the cable services started, maybe 8 or 10 years later. But that in the early, we're talking about a 60-year span for cable, and in the first 10 years, the channels changed dramatically in content, and the different cable services changed dramatically in content. And very few cable services were like Comcast that had many franchises. Comcast, the biggest cable operators in the country, have many cable stations now in franchises as compared to other places that have just 1 or 2 franchises. But a franchise in a cable company to service the area is a very productive thing and profitable thing because you don't have any program costs. People to get on your channels have to pay. You deliver the services into the home at minimum service costs, and there is no competition. It's exactly like the telephone companies of land-based phones at the early parts of the telephone company, where they were able to put on telephone services to the homes, and there was no competition. The same went for the cable companies. You could go into the homes with no competition because the city fathers in any municipality would not allow it. And that was a good thing because the services needed money to fund it. If it had been competitive, we may not have had good service, and it would be a duplication of services if the markets were too small in installing equipment. And remember, there's a big investment that had to take place, and that was taking place in each city that had a franchise. There was a bidding contest or drawing the franchise rights out of the hat. But whoever got the franchise for a cable section in a major city or a major conventional sized city, they were in the driver's seat to make huge profits. And due to today, there's nothing more profitable than a cable company in a community, because the cable company has the right to service not only now the cable of programming, but they can service computer services. Don't forget they have the wire into the home, the fiber optic wire, and they also have the telephone services. So today, you could have any one of those services also provide the two other services. One, if you had the cable service, you could provide program and telephone and computer services, just because the fiber optic wire comes into the home. So without my rambling too much, think of the wire into the home, and it can be one of three people who own it. And in every city, there is no competition once that happens, and you'll have many homes that are pestered constantly by the different companies. If you buy one service for one thing and don't buy the other two services offered by the same supplier, you could have three different services servicing your computer, your telephone, or your cable. And that doesn't always happen. You usually have one of three or two of three, but more and more people are finding better deals if one cable company or one telephone company or one computer service company provides everything over the same wire, and there's no difficulty.
When you came to Warner, the concept was new, interactive television, and you were to assemble a team of people to develop that concept and make it happen in Columbus. What were your goals, and how did you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, we're mindful that we're on a limited budget. Number two, we had the right to fail, but it was going to hold us up in providing services for cable franchise applications in different cities. Remember, in the back of us, we had to get on the air fast. We had to be providing services that the city fathers in other cities would like. And we had to do things at a very small budget. So with what we did with QUBE in Columbus was to assemble a team of young people who had no training whatsoever, orientate them to our goals. There wasn't a person in that group over 25. We paid them very little money. We moved them to Columbus, where they were all New Yorkers and weren't anxious to go. I used to have to bring them hot dogs and hamburgers or pastrami from New York delis to make them feel at home, because they were all New Yorkers. They weren't from the local town at all. One or two people did various service aspects, but the program people were all young people who wanted just to do something interesting, and knew the new media would be something. When we did open the show in Columbus, the BBC and broadcasting companies throughout the world covered it because it was an exciting new experience, and who knows, maybe it was going to work. We didn't know it was going to work for sure. The Columbus formula of QUBE, it did later, of course, give rise to things like Nickelodeon and MTV. And there was a success formula there that permitted Warners to have franchises throughout the country. But everybody copied, to this day, the original objectives and principles that existed in QUBE. QUBE was the birthplace as much as the Mayflower landing of the Pilgrims to create the United States. It was the cat's meow as far as people pouring in to see how it's done, where our studios were, how we permitted so many cameras and delivery systems to be going out in special air-conditioned rooms. That was all a big challenge that if we didn't know too much about it, would become very big authorities within 3 months of broken down channels, not clear images, and not the ability always to find out. Remember, it was a two-way system. You could stay in the home and test a simulated SAT exam by punching out certain numbers on the control box that you had on your hand. That was new. Upstream capability from the home back the other way. But we weren't as excited about what was coming from the home. To this day, we're not as so excited about what's coming from the home if they had upstream capability, and most places don't today. Upstream capability is only of value with the telephone services, but upstream capability for cable companies is a nothingness now. But then it was a big, exciting thing.
CUBE, it's an odd word. What was the genesis of that?
CUBE was a word that had to be short. It had to do with something that was numerical and something that was easily identified. But there were 5,000 names and words that were used in place of cube, and I think if you called it honk, H-O-N-K, or blank, it probably would have carried just as well. I don't think that much time was given to the selection of the word cube. It was on a list of 100. We got down to 10. We got down to 5. There was one called Hope and one called Bang. But CUBE won out, and you know, a rose by another name is just as effective.
From what I understand, one of the objectives before you were on the air was to find somebody that was local talent and would attract local attention. I think the original idea was to get a news anchor guy or something like that. Ended up with Flippo the Clown. How did that all come about?
Well, we wanted somebody important, and I kept retreating to get somebody who was safe. And Flippo the Clown, clowns attract many people. I failed to get, you know, what would be a Walter Cronkite today, or an Ed Murrow. Certainly not anybody of stature would be in Columbus. They could be recognizable, but I couldn't take them from the newspaper and pay them big money. I couldn't take them if they only were able in sports. I had to have somebody who had universal appeal. And a clown, to me, appealed to all ages. I was not very creative. I needed somebody who was a single party. I couldn't even afford a team of 2 people. Clowns work alone. They make faces. They dress up themselves. And Flippo, a local product, was there. And I'm sure I spent over 5 minutes deciding that he was fine or not fine. And if he hadn't worked, we'd got somebody else. We'd got a mouse or a kangaroo with a man inside of it, a kangaroo uniform. That would have gone fine. But, you know, you got Flippo, and it's the only thing in town that the kids liked and the adults liked. He became an institution within 36 hours.
When you first came there at Warner, there must have been some history before you got there of building an interactive two-way system. Who were working out the details of what this new technology
Well,
was going to be in Columbus?
we had something called Mod Squad. Mod Squad of 10 young people concentrated on the program content. The program content sometimes affected or demanded new technical support of some kinds, particularly if it was two-way. But the engineering people were so surfeited with the challenge of presenting 12 or 14 channels that the biggest crisis they faced was the air conditioning of the delivery channels from special machines that were carrying the films. And the refrigeration was not, to the public, a very interesting or exciting point. But even the size of the room that the equipment was in became a good point. But there also was a big problem that this wire into the home, because it was two-way, often we found out certain things that we could know what their sleeping habits were, and what their actions were on a two-way system by giving out certain tests and all. And sometimes we stumbled upon information that was rather personal, because the people were willing to transmit it, that we didn't know what to do with that information that came upstream. So the use of the upstream capability from the home was not very popular with the management and certainly the legal department at Warner's, because it wasn't something they wanted to deal with. They thought it was an invasion of privacy or materials that they wanted, that somebody could find out, and they didn't want people to know what was going on.
Tell me about Spencer Harrison. What was he involved
Spencer
in?
Harrison was the legal eagle, a man who was trained at CBS in business affairs and finance, who was really a key management figure, because it was his job, not as a lawyer to say no, as lawyers are often prone to do, but Spencer Harrison was a key leader in making our objectives financially and legally sound in a community. You must remember, we were constantly stepping over the lines of what we could or could not do, and he had to maneuver the local municipal people to permit us to do it, and let the creative people not wander off and do things they shouldn't. But most of all, he kept saying, we got to get the show on the air. So he was a key member of my program team.
We talked about the Children's Channel. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about Vivian Horner and what her plans were with the Children's Channel.
The children's programming, which I learned from my experience in starting Sesame Street with Joan Cooney, was that you had to have a professional involved. I had children, but I had to realize that having a children's channel had to be very well planned and constructed with the same sincerity that the people who started Sesame Street was. So where better to get somebody to run our Pinwheel and later Nickelodeon than from Sesame Street. And Vivian Horner had just started planning something called the Electric Company, which was the second step of Sesame Street. But she was active in Sesame Street with the creative staff. So we took that Vivian Horner, who was also head of the Bank Street School, a preparatory teachers college for those who wanted to work with teeny tots before the ages of 5. The Bank Street School did that work. And I hired Vivian Horner from that Bank Street School to come to the QUBE experiment and create Pinwheel and Nickelodeon, and Pinwheel in particular, although she was part of the regular team, to concentrate her energies in helping to create a cable Sesame Street. But we went one step further. We sent her around the world to collect the best children's films for little tots. And you know, the Iron Curtain countries were very good in broadcasting and creating, particularly those in Russia and in China and etc., creating programs that were very good for children, in England too, incidentally. So we were able to buy up worldwide rights in perpetuity, which they probably still have today, for the United States. They were so glad to sell it. They didn't know why anybody would want it, but we redubbed them. And there was one Fat and Skinny we didn't have, called Fat and Skinny from England, which was a huge hit, or the Red Balloons. They were tremendous hits here. They were done with fine quality of major productions, but we could buy them for nothing. And we had them, and we carried them on the air in between the regular programming. So the adults even started to look at some of our feature films, which were really addressed to children, but you know, the children were sitting with their parents, and it was something that, it was a coup that we never thought possible. We wanted just to buy little children's shows and cartoons. They were cartoons, mostly, not real people, actors and actresses. But it was simply wonderful to be able to buy these, and we must have bought 125 films. And with children, you can have a repeat factor of 10, 20, 30 times. The kids love things to be done over and over. You know, how many times the little children say, "Daddy, tell me about the Three Bears," or Little Red Riding Hood. It wasn't ever told once. So repetition is a great thing for children's programming because it lowered our budgets. The adult programming doesn't exactly fall in the same category.
I don't know if you remember, but one of the pilots that never actually made it into full production was called The Home Show. And it was shot in Connecticut, and it was about a husband and wife family, and he was a lawyer, and there were a lot of really interesting interactive concepts in there. Do you remember anything?
Yes, I do. We had 3 phases of The Home Show. One, a show that showed a lot of different services: how to cook, how to sew, how to cut the lawn, how to wash the car, all of that thing. That failed in our test pilots and was too costly. Then we had a show that women, essentially the home show, because we figured they were really running the things, that would take into all the women's services, cooking and cleaning and sewing and getting the kids ready for school. That failed just as it did on the network broadcasting. People were bored with that. They didn't want to do it. It isn't like the sophisticated food shows today on the air. You know, it was how to chop a chicken and liver and all that, and then how to sew, and it was boring. Women wanted more entertainment. And even the cooking shows today, they come Barefoot Countessa and things like that, they have a lot of charm and sophistication. We were so heavy and so terrible that we ran into the same trouble that the networks did. The networks tried home shows. I tried home shows before that on the major networks. It didn't work. Arlene Francis, Kitty Kilgallen, 11 to 12 in the morning, never worked, and they were very costly failures.
The window concept is something that you developed early with the Today Show.
That is right.
And you tried to carry that through with the new interactive concept, first with Mike's Diner, and then making sure there was a window in the Columbus studios. Explain your idea of what that was all about.
Well, when I started the Today Show in 1952, we took the RCA exhibition hall where General Sarnoff had that hall or store converted to show the RCA furniture and equipment, television sets, etc., radio sets, and some furniture exactly that housed those. That equipment was an ideal place because it was like any store window. It was 52nd Street, 50th Street, 49th Street, and right across from 30 Rockefeller Plaza. People passed by, and the passage of people going by, fire trucks, police cars, people looking through the window, seeing the snow fall. It gave people at home a feeling of watching what was going on in New York, particularly in Rockefeller Center. Because it wasn't very long before we got the cameras to go outside and picture things going on outside. So I thought that was a great thing for Columbus. I argued we ought to be on a busy street with a window and interview people every day walking by, you know, who's your favorite person in the movie that day? Do you like a certain food? What are you going to do for Valentine's Day, you know, Mother's Day? You know, we'd have a man on the street every day. A problem, what's the best way to cure a cold? Are you going to stay home for Christmas? What's the best present you can think of? I wanted a questioning reporter every day. A guy talking about the weather in Columbus every day. I thought it was the best idea possible. I couldn't put it together to save my soul. It was too much money to business, like to invest money in something like that. You had to have big money, and the wonderful people that were on made well by the Today Show were not available to appear on the local show. It was just another. It was doing more than I could chew. It failed.
Well, but many of the shows that were premiered in Columbus, the interactive QUBE shows, sort of mirrored to some extent 1950 shows. Was that a plan? Was it an accident? How did that come?
I just copied things that were done by the networks. I tried to get things that I thought of that would translate itself to local productions. I failed consistently to imitate anything done by the network background I had because of budget, because of lack of talent, because of the terrific load of the number of channels that we were carrying. We started QUBE in Columbus with so many channels that simply were awful. As a matter of fact, we had one channel played music with lighting behind it, and the lighting changes and the colors and all of that. There never was such a waste of channels as we had, because I just couldn't come up with things that would fill that channel.
Vivian was also in charge of a learning channel.
It was. We taught people. We were trying to teach people what grade. We were trying to teach people English. We had complaints from the Polish community that we should teach Polish people to how to speak English and speak in Polish. We had trouble with other people who thought that the words we used were too big. We did no research like they did for Sesame Street on how to teach. And the educational people at Ohio State and in the teachers group were not at all interested in what we were doing. It was competitive. It was biting off more than we could choose, and we did a bad job.
You seem to have a good eye for the right people. What was your starting strategy when you got all these kids together?
My first strategy was people who looked well, who spoke well, and who did not try to be more sophisticated than the people of Columbus. I didn't want somebody to develop personalities that had a following like they do in big-time television. Guys who talk fast, sexy girls. I had to have very simple people who use simple words. And that was very tough. I never found a single personality that dominated the community and expressed to be homespun. Like there was a man by the name of Cedric Adams in Minneapolis who became so popular locally that CBS took him on the network. Arthur Godfrey started with one station that he was on and then expanded. I didn't find anybody like that. A guy who can, it's usually a man, seldom a woman, never a woman. I couldn't find men who really were able to capture the whole person at the whole other end of the wire. The clown, Flippo the Clown, was the only one I worked it with.
This is a question from Mr. Blumenthal. Those of us who worked in the New York office before moving to Columbus remember your large office and conference table, sometimes two conference tables, and mornings listening to you advise Fred Silverman. The meetings always seemed a bit unfocused, but they were wonderfully entertaining. What were you trying to accomplish in these meetings when your key people knew so little about what QUBE might become?
My problem with building a young person's staff, they were all university trained, so that they were used to a set curriculum, whether it was textbooks or no textbooks. I had to walk into that meeting every morning at a long table that carried 24 people. It was bigger than Steve Ross's table. It was bigger than the director's room. Board of Directors meetings. It was a huge office. It was at least 30 feet by 20 feet. That's big, 25 feet. And it was the largest room ever, but far bigger than the president or chairman of the board of Warner Brothers. They gave me that office because they knew I needed a lot of people. He had 2 bathrooms. And so as a result, I had to come to that table every morning to the most critical group in the world, angry, aggressive, tired, energetic people like out of a classroom with no set curriculum except to keep them revved up and most of all talking them into going to Columbus. These New York kids didn't want to leave New York. They loved coming there, and they were compensated for it. Not a lot, but enough to keep them interested.
Tell us about Larry Hilford. Larry was QUBE's president, and he seemed like a talented executive. What were you looking for in a senior executive? How did you find Larry?
I was anxious to find a person who had moved to Columbus, eventually become president of the Rotary Club, head of any campaign drive. I wanted the station, because it was a Columbus station, to identify with the community, because if Columbus succeeded, if QUBE would succeed in Columbus, which it didn't, it did not succeed. We learned from it. We got other franchises from it. But it was not a towering success. The ratings simply don't indicate that. But I thought one of the ways to get that is to get somebody who was Mr. Columbus. He was Mr. New York. He failed. I've had 5 people in that job, and I never got one of them to become Mr. Columbus. He went on the air, he read good things, poems to the children. It never worked.
Overall, were you happy with what developed with QUBE? Did it seem to match what you originally thought it would be?
Sure. It was the greatest learning, QUBE was the latest learning experience that everybody involved with it. Most of them went on to take an active role in the cable industry at one level or another, become an example to all other people trying. It was a great training experience that I learned a lot from. Don't forget, I brought some background from the experience of network broadcasting, conventional network broadcasting. It made me learn the difference that cable had in its selectivity. And when you're operating 25 channels at one time, or 30 channels, today it's 100 channels. But I really had an experience that was priceless to me as I went on in life. Where today I'm working for large companies throughout the world in the changeover from network broadcasting to the cable systems, which QUBE monitored or created as a first cable system in the United States that functioned on a way that Comcast and Cablevision and Time Warner and dozens of other, Ted Turner pioneered cable as much as anybody else, of course, with CNN, etc., and the feature film channels. But he was the, I wouldn't say that I was Ted Turner, but in some way I was the poor man's Ted Turner, in that sense that I would consider Ted Turner the father of cable by using his single powerful station in Atlanta to become a delivery system of feature films and later for news throughout the United States.
You said a few times that QUBE was the future. Can you explain that to me?
Well, everybody copied the QUBE system, just as Nickelodeon and MTV today are 2 or 3 channels of MTV and grew like Topsy to be very, very valuable program services. They also showed other program services to specialize and concentrate on a particular audience, age group, demographic of male versus female, 18 to 24 versus 24 to 72 or 76. These channels today are selective in their demographic appeal and are like women's magazines or fashion magazines or food magazines or motor car magazines. They function hitting a target audience. They're very effective because they can become successful by, remember, they're all advertising supported. The advertising revenue poured in for people who concentrated on one specific audience and didn't try to function like a network does to please all the people all the time. Please the 18th, take one cable channel for Disney, ABC Family Channel, the most successful, 18 to 49 for women in the business, making more money than anybody else. On the other hand, ESPN makes huge sums because they pour to the male appeal with their sports. Obviously, the Food Channel operates to satisfying food clients. Remember, the advertising supported, who want to move good food services and products to the American public. It became a lightning rod to show other channels become a specialty channel of your own, and you will succeed.
I was in contact with Ann Cullen, Bill Cullen's wife, and one of the things that she said, she thoroughly enjoyed her trip to Columbus when Bill was there to do How Do You Like Your Eggs? She really enjoyed your telling her stories on the plane as you flew them from Los Angeles in, I guess it was Warner's corporate jet. Tell me about the How Do You Like Your Eggs pilot, how you secured Bill Cullen, just a little history on that.
I did. That was brought to me by a member of the staff who I cannot remember. It was the first venture we had to create a program, an individual program that could be scheduled like at a network. It was so challenging an effort that I designated one executive to watch over it. I knew I couldn't do it myself. And they were so experienced. Professional people were involved with that show. We paid more money for the certain people on it than ever before. And it was not typical of what we went on after that. Other people copied it on the other network, on the other cable channels in the future. but it was the first really successful effort to do specialized programming that could be found on a major network.
What was, I think Steve Carlin was your guy from $64,000.
Yes, he was.
You came for that premiere, Gus Hauser came for that premiere, a lot of, John Fletcher came for
Yeah.
that premiere. Tell me what you thought when you saw it, and, you know, how do you think it was, did you think it was successful?
I thought it was successful. It didn't turn out to be successful in the long run. But that night, that day, I know we were so, this was such a big venture for us. And to get Steve Carlin, here's the man who did $64,000 question. I talked him into it. And, you know, Steve is gone now, and lovely man. I took him out to dinner 2 or 3 times. I flew him out in the Warner jet. He was a shy little man and quite egocentric. And I sort of conned him into doing the show and creating it for us. Never turned out, but we had high hopes.
Tell us about your relationship with Gus Hauser in the early days in New York. You were often seen stomping through the halls in your stocking feet, muttering to yourself or a colleague about a difficult meeting with Gus. At times you did not present Gus as a friend. What was that all about?
Gus, I constantly was battling Gus because he wanted me to do certain things and get things on the air quickly. I was more professionally trained to do them better and then get them on the air. The big explosion came with Gus. I wrote overnight letters. I stayed up all night writing him terrible, mean letters because he was my boss. But I could always go to Ross to overrule him. But he was my boss. And I wasn't a very good employee because he was anxious to get QUBE on the air quicker than I wanted it to be on the air. That was the big thing. That was the hurdle I had. He wanted to take QUBE as an example around to the other founding fathers throughout the country to get more franchises. I never knew that was his goal. He never explained it to me. I don't think I would have fought him as much if I knew that. But he never did, and I found out later on. He was right and I was wrong. I was looking for the perfect programs to win it in Columbus. He was saying, I want the country.
When you first saw the QUBE console, what did you think? The little button pushing thing, the remote. What did you think of that?
Well, I helped pick it in size. I helped pick it in color. I helped pick it in the length of the wire to the set. I was so excited that it worked that I was thrilled with it. I never had any reservations about it at all because they never existed before.
Did you have as much fun as we did?
No. Oh, no. At first I was a New Yorker. I didn't like the Olentangy Hilton. I liked good restaurants. I hated Columbus. I was a Michigan man, so I was a Wolverine. I did not enjoy my QUBE experience like I enjoyed my sojourn with NBC or CBS because I didn't have the power. I didn't accept the fact that this was a new system and you needed a team player of the engineers, of salespeople. I was not a team player. I had a big ego. And I really, if I was to relive my experiences there, I would have been more of an adult professional. And I resent the fact that about myself that was true, that I was too competitive. But I was a good leader for the young people who were there to achieve the goals I wanted to. It's just that I was too spoiled from the power I had of running everything at the networks. Don't forget the day President Kennedy was assassinated, I sat down and decided, practically single-handedly, that the network would not go on the air with any entertainment programming from that Friday 1 o'clock time period to Monday evening after the funeral services for entertainment programs. The entire industry followed that. Now here's a guy who had that power to establish that kind of a thing, fooling around with QUBE and everybody around it. I thought I should have that same power, and I didn't. It was probably, I'm not proud of that aspect of what I did. Well, one of the things about the Today Show for me, since it was really the first important television venture, there was no real television programming prior to that meant anything at all. We had to first force the affiliates throughout the country to carry it, the Today Show, because there were no morning program on. There were no stations in operation in television. I had to go out and coax certain television station owners who had one or more stations to carry the show, because they didn't want to open up the plant, their broadcast studios, until noon, when the network started their regular programming. They didn't want any local programming on before then. They wanted to carry network shows, and with the result, that was the first hurdle. The second hurdle is, you start a program at 7 a.m., I had to find a producer who was going to be good and a staff that was going to be good, who would get up at 5 a.m. 5 times a week, because you had to get up at 5 o'clock. You had to be in the studio by 6. Some people lived in the suburbs, which meant that they were getting up at 4:30. Dave Garroway when I hired Dave Garroway to do it, I had to and it wasn't getting a big rating. People were watching radio, or listening to radios then, not television. First, to get the affiliates to carry it. The company-owned stations weren't hard. They took it. But then I had to get advertisers. And the magazine plan didn't work then, where you sold one program to an advertiser. We had many advertisers. So the first advertiser we had on, in the break for a commercial, was General Motors and the Appian Way Pizza Pie Company. That was a big step to have that. And then later on, to get the affiliates to carry the Today Show. And then hiring a man like Dave Garroway, who tended to be very sullen. The program was very serious at the beginning. And we didn't have anybody to do the commercials. There were no television commercials. And the affiliate stations were coming aboard, but the audience itself, the general audience, wasn't there yet. And we got J. Fred Muggs on, this chimp. And the chimp was jumping around the studio, pulling everybody's hair, throwing things on the floor. And Dave came into me and said, Mike, he says, you know, this chimp is driving me crazy. I said, but the ratings have doubled. He says, listen, I'm not going to argue about it. He says, it's either me or the chimps. And I said, David, don't make me make that choice. The chimp stays. Dave gave me a glare, walked out of the office. We didn't talk for a month. Then he came around to it, and it was fine.
You dealt with a lot of difficult super personalities in your lifetime. Jackie Gleason was probably one of the biggest.
The hardest. Jackie, because he was an alcoholic, and by noon he was terrible and not able to really have an intelligent conversation, terribly egocentric, the most brilliant comic in the world. He conducted the orchestra, write scores, play drama, serious drama, did in the movies. He was something, but he never wanted to rehearse, and he was drinking all the time. And he finally we moved the show down to Florida. He stayed at the Doral, and he used to wake up every Friday morning, and we taped on Saturday, and then showed it Saturday night. And he would say to me, "Pal, I'm not going on, pal." And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" He says, "Well, you come on out and I'll tell you." I come down, fly down from my office many times on a Friday morning, leave on the 10 o'clock plane, get here at 1 o'clock, go right to Doral Country Club, catch him on the golf rounds, see a bottle of vodka on the front of the little wagon he was driving around. I walk up to him, he says, "Pal, what are you doing down here?" I mean, what I do down here, you know, so what do I say? Jackie, you knew I was coming. I'd say, "Jackie, I was just around, I wanted to see you." "Oh, sure, pal, ride around with me." And we go around, he'd do the show. But Jackie is the only man I ever dealt with that quit every season he was in, never 2 years in a row, after doing a hit show. He quit Art Carney and the Honeymooners. They could have made, Nat Hiken could have made 30 more episodes, 40 more episodes, 50 more episodes. He didn't want to. He quit. He had the show with the dance. He wouldn't rehearse. He would come on and be characters all the time, repeat himself. The audience loved him. He could repeat himself. I once ran into Frank Fontaine, who did Joe the bartender sketch with him. And Frank Fontaine would, I ran into him in front of the Ed Sullivan Theater, 6 o'clock at night, Friday, when they were going to do the dress rehearsal, and I had to go over there to see how he was. And I saw Frank, and I said, "Frank, why are you here?" He says, "I'm rehearsing the sketch." I says, "No, Jackie." He says, "I do it alone." Yeah, he says, "Well, how does he know what to do?" He says, "He just does takes." Now, a takes is when he puts his hand over his mouth and says, "Pal, whoa." But see, Frank Fontaine would say something was stupid, and he'd go, "Huh?" And then that would get a big laugh. Well, he would do takes. And Frank Fontaine knew what his lines were, and Jackie would do things like that. That was typical of Jackie. He'd come on and be the great Mr. Big, you know, and with his dinner jacket suit and a top hat, or be a beggar, or be something, you know, different. And he was impossible because he repeated himself over and over. But if the public likes him, you're not going to cancel him. He canceled himself.
Probably even bigger problem, the Smothers Brothers?
No, Smothers Brothers were different. Smothers Brothers, who I saw down here last week, were against the Vietnam War. Pete Seeger, who was on the show, was against the Vietnam War. They had Nichols and May on, who were against the war. Dr. Stanton was very close to, President of CBS was very close to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson would like the Smothers Brothers, but they were anti-war. So Dr. Stanton would call me from the White House and tell me, "You can't keep the Smothers Brothers on." And I kept them on, and they kept rubbing it in about, they had Pete Seeger sing a song called "The Big Muddy," about a black man who was in the Vietnam War, and he comes back to the Vietnam War, and he's walking through the muddy rivers of the Mississippi, singing "The Big Muddy." Well, gee, I mean, the crickets, he just rubbed their nose in it. So I finally had to cancel them in their third year. They were being Bonanza with the right audience. And I had trouble with Bonanza on NBC. They were my saviors. And God Almighty, we had to finally get the affiliates, the Southern affiliates in particular, who were very anti-Smothers Brothers because of their being liberal, showed the show on Friday to them in advance. We promised them that, but I had to have the cassette on Thursday. And the Thursday came, and I didn't have the DVD. I went into Bob Wood's office on a Friday morning, and Bob Wood with John Apple, the lawyer, was sitting there, and he says, "You have the DVD to show the affiliates. It's late." I says, "I don't have it." And John Apple, the guy in the chairs, jumps up and says, "We got him." I said, "What the hell do you mean we got him? You got a show for Sunday night, 9 to 10 against Bonanza?" I lost the battle. They'll tell you. I just spent the last 2 weeks ago, they were here on a tour, and we went and spent the day together. They knew they did it to themselves. They later sued CBS for millions of dollars, and I testified before them in their behalf of why we canceled them, and they won the suit, and they got several $million anyway.
This is probably the last question. Tell me about Operation 100.
And I was very competitive with NBC. I was at CBS then. And for the first time in my history in broadcasting, I was losing the ratings race to NBC by a full point every week. Now, I had 100 days left out of the 300 days in all that the season was from September to April 15th. January 1st, they were one full point ahead of us. I didn't know whether I was going to be fired by Paley, but I was worried. And I called the staff in, and I said, between now and April 15th, I am going to program the network as long as the way I see it. I'm going to change time positions. I'm going to rename shows. I'm going to buy new features. And everything is going to be promote. And I'm not going to put on any programming that doesn't have a good rating. And suddenly, there was a guy by the name of Bob Klein at NBC, who was the head of the research department, and plotted their activities. And he was laughing and telling Les Brown at Variety magazine, the trade magazine for the industry, how he was going to win. And suddenly in January, he saw the ratings start to slip, because I would take a documentary about the Eskimos, and I'd say, the Eskimo documentary, fight for survival and losing. I took something called Born Free out of the feature film lineup on Friday nights, which is 9 to 11. I put it at Fred Silverman's suggestion, 7 to 9, where I put Wizard of Oz, a children's show, and I promoted the show for children on the children's programming time with the little lionesses. On the soap operas, where the woman in the show harbored and loved the cubs, appealing to the woman audience, and to promos for the men about the fierce aspects of the lions, went through the roof. I moved a special viewing of Wizard of Oz to 7 to 9, which was counted as the Nielsen Times. I got ratings on shows people couldn't believe on there. I put in every strong special I could, renamed shows, dropped public service shows I was going to run, and I won by 0.3 of a point over NBC. That was 100. Bill Paley couldn't believe it. Everybody was ashamed. I mean, it was Jack Gould of the New York Times was pretty rough on me, and the industry was pretty rough at me. How can you take schedules and just push ahead for numbers? But this business was about numbers. It's all in the numbers. There's no successful as a good show with bad ratings, and no success things as a bad show with good ratings. And I knew that. If the show had the ratings, I put it on. And I put on very good shows like The Defenders and other shows at night, but I had to have the circulation to present it. I could put on S. Hurok Presents and do specials of great quality, but to balance it, I put on Peter Pan in specials to get the kids. Now, am I versatile or swinging from one side to another? No, I believe you have to pay Peter to buy Peter to play Paul, or whatever it is, to convince management to let me do what I wanted. But most of all, you have to deliver a bigger audience to please some of the people all the time, and then have enough left over to please a small part of the people some of the time, too. And that was, my secret of success was raising enough money on one hand in circulation and programming to pay for the cultural programs like Producers Showcase, Jessica Tandy, Four Poster, and Hume Cronin, and those quality things, or even Peter Pan, a quality show, rather than sticking to one kind of show or another and just keeping the profits.